Hello, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of everyone here, we'd like to welcome you for this evening's presentation, which promises to be a fascinating lecture with author, historian, and archaeologist Damian Shiels. It's always special when we have the chance to come here together, surrounded by the echoes of history, to learn a little bit more about the past and help to see it with fresh eyes. We'd like to offer, from the National Park Service, we'd like to offer our heartfelt thanks to Wayne Motts and the Gettysburg Foundation for helping make this evening happen. Wayne and the Foundation's dedication to preserving and sharing Gettysburg's story has made a real difference, and so we're greatly appreciative. As we gather here on these hallowed grounds, we're reminded that Gettysburg is more than just a chapter in a textbook. It's a symbol of courage and sacrifice and the struggle to hold a nation together. The lessons from this place still speak to us about who we are, what we value, and how ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary moments. So we thank you again for being here, and we hope tonight inspires you to carry these stories forward. And with that, I'll introduce Wayne Motts.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate that for the heartfelt welcome. On behalf of Jackie Spanauer, the president and CEO of the Gettysburg Foundation, I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening. She could not be with us, so you're stuck with the old-timer, the president emeritus and historian, myself. And I'm just happy to welcome you all here, and we're so happy that our speaker is with us today. In case you did not know, our speaker has traveled 4,500 miles to be here with us this evening. So I calculated, I looked it up on a map. So he's come from awful far away, so if you want to see him in person, right now is the best time to be able to do that. Preliminary announcements. If you have a cell phone, please take that out of your pocket right now and set that on silent. If during the presentation you need to leave and hit the restroom, you'll go right out the doorway, you'll go back toward the doors that you came into, the front doors, and the restrooms will be right there on your left if you have to use the restroom during the presentation. When the presentation is over, you will go out the same door you came in, which is the front door, but not before you stop at the signing table and pick up your copy of Irish Americans in the Union Military, everybody, which is Damian's book. He will be signing this immediately following this presentation. We're going to rush him out of here so he doesn't get waylaid by all your questions here. We'll take some questions at the end of the program, but we want to make sure he gets out to the signing table. And if you want to get his signature on this work and support the foundation in the park by buying this book at the gift shop, please do so this evening. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, so I'm going to give you a little bit about him. Dr. Damian Shiels is a historian who specializes in Irish and immigrant service during the American Civil War. He established the IrishAmericanCivilWar.com website in 2010 and is the author of 3 books on the Civil War Irish, most recently Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, LSU Press. And Damian, when was it issued? It just came out, right?
It's a couple of weeks ago.
Couple weeks ago, so it's brand new. He is currently a research fellow at Northumbria University in England, where he works on a project exploring common U.S. sailors during the American Civil War. So without further ado, the author of Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, please help me welcome Damian Shiels.
Thanks, Wayne.
You bet.
Cheers. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody, for coming. I'd like to start by just thanking the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park for making this happen and for treating me really well. It's fantastic. There's no better place, really, to be coming to give a talk than Gettysburg, no matter how far you have to come. Even if it's from Finland, it is worth it. Because, of course, this is the place where most of the Union soldiers who fought in the Army of the Potomac wanted to be remembered, even if you didn't do a whole lot here. One example I can think of being the 9th Massachusetts Infantry, an Irish regiment. Their big battles were Gaines Mill in the wilderness, but they needed their monument here, not there. So this is the place to be if you want to discuss the Irish in the Civil War. So I'm going to discuss some of the themes I cover in the book tonight, but I wanted to make it, because of where we are, very specific to Gettysburg, so that the people we're talking about served here, many of them fell here. So I am going to incorporate some other material, just a few bits and pieces from the website Wayne was mentioning, and also from a couple of the previous books. But the main themes I'm discussing are themes that are in the new book. I want to start by getting you to think about what you think about when you think about the Irish at Gettysburg. And I bet you the first thing that comes to your head is these lads. And it is the best monument on the field, in my opinion. It's fantastic. I'm a big dog person anyway, so anyway, that and Sally get my vote every time. But obviously this is the New York regiments of the Irish Brigade, the most famous ethnic Irish unit in the American Civil War. Dominates our concepts of the Irish in the American Civil War. If you're really into it, you might think about the 69 Pennsylvania, who of course were key to successfully repulsing Pickett's charge, one of the most heavily engaged units. During that charge, lots of Irish guys die in that unit, an ethnic Irish unit. If you really are into it and are out for a bit of luck, you might think about Colonel Patrick O'Rourke of the 140th New York. As everyone knows, the most important action to take place on Little Round Top on the 2nd of July. There's some other main unit, I think, but anyway, these guys, this is where it's at. But in both our popular memory of the war and our historical study of it, all our focus has been on these kind of higher level officers, on the Irish Brigade, on the ethnic, what I call green flag units. And of course, there's a reason for that, because then as now, those units were seen as the main representatives of the Irish experience in the war. The men who served in the war, even if they didn't serve in those units, saw them as the main Irish representatives. They were the ones that everybody wrote about, the ones that they spoke about. They were the ones that where the most readily identifiable Irish account survives. So they're the ones with unit histories that we can look at if we're looking for the Irish experience. And it's most usually the words of their officers, particularly officers from units like the Irish Brigade, that have been left to us. And so it's on those ethnic units, those green flag units that we've built the scaffolding, if you like, as I call it, of our understanding of all Irish-American involvement in the US military in the Civil War. But it creates a problem. I did this actually for this talk. This was a bad idea, actually, because it took me ages. But I went through to try and give you an idea of the actual Irish-American experience of the American Civil War. These are dots on the map that just show units who fought here. It's a preliminary map, it's not complete, there are more than this. Units who fought here that suffered an Irish-American fatality. Not units that Irish-Americans served in, every one of them suffered a fatality who was an Irish-American soldier. Okay? 17 different states and the United States regulars represented. And New York top, Pennsylvania second, Massachusetts are just as the representation of the Irish was. That was the ranking of Irish-American representation. The reality of the American Civil War was that the great majority of Irish-American troops did not fight in the Irish Brigade, did not fight in the 69 Pennsylvania, and did not fight in an ethnic Irish unit. So this was the question I was asking myself. When nearly all we know about the Irish experience, Irish motivations, Irish attitudes, how committed these Irish were to the United States, comes from a focus just on units like the Irish Brigade, what might reincorporating the words, the thoughts, the actions of this silent majority, the men in all these other units, how might that change the picture? So it's reincorporating these men into both our perceptions and our memory of the Irish and the American Civil War was one of the things I wanted to achieve with Green and Blue. Another that I wanted to do was to try and get past the very oft-quoted words and attitudes of Irish officers like Thomas Francis Mars and people like this, interested in all as he is, to try and get to the enlisted, working class, rank and file Irish. It might surprise you, given the absolute ocean of correspondence we have from the American Civil War. Every scholar who's worked on the Irish Americans has had a problem. There just isn't very many enlisted men's letters. The absence of these men's voices hasn't been from most of our history, hasn't been for the want of trying from Civil War historians. And there's been an awful lot of exceptional and exceptionally valuable work undertaken on the Irish in the Civil War, but the letters just weren't there. this lack of source survival has been a real issue. But there is a solution to it. It sometimes can seem hard to believe, as I say, that when there's so many of these letters everywhere, but it's in the melancholy fate of men like this man here, Michael Higgins of the 125th New York, that we find the answer to finding the enlisted men's experience across the Union military. When Michael's mother applied for a government pension after her son was killed here on the 3rd of July 1863, in a pension system where they're colloquially called the widow's pensions his mother was applying for, she included her son's wartime letters because in them he said he had sent her money and she had to prove that he had sent her money. And so that's why she includes them. So that's easy, as you say. So fast forward 10 years I spent going through the pension files looking for Irish American correspondence across all the units. And in the end, it produced a corpus of 1,432 wartime letters relating to 568 Irish American men. It's the largest body of Irish American wartime correspondence yet identified. The picture that we saw a minute ago looking at Gettysburg and the casualties on the field there illustrates in microcosm the breadth of the Irish American experience across the entire war. Right? And it's reflected in the letters that these men left behind. Of those letters I was looking at, the identified correspondence relates to men who served in more than 260 different units in every theatre of war on land and at sea in which the United States was engaged, and almost 98% of them were enlisted men from the ranks. So these then are the common soldiers and sailors of the conflict. Their letters tell us about how Irish Americans experienced the war, from what they thought about life in camp, on the battlefield, to how they interacted with religion, race, and politics, all of which are themes I discuss in the book. They tell us about how they saw themselves and how they saw the cause for which they were fighting. I'm not going to discuss the widows' pensions in any detail tonight, but one of the really valuable elements of them is the contextual information that surrounds these letters. You can see these people's lives before they leave Ireland, after they leave Ireland. You see what jobs they worked, all their families. So you have context for these letters, which is hugely important. So before we dive into some of the kind of individual letters, I do want to talk about some of the facts and figures relating to Irish American service. Get the boring bit out of the way in the initial part. One of the really big things, and this is a long-held, you will read it in a huge amount of Civil War history, is that the Irish Americans were underrepresented in the United States military. This is really important. They were not underrepresented. Actually, it is to do with an incorrect, and I've done it myself actually in my first book I published it. We have not been counting the numbers of Irish correctly. They actually were slightly overrepresented, if anything. They served at or over their proportion of the population in the United States. A conservative estimate of the number of Irish-born men who fought for the United States in the American Civil War is 180,000 Irish-born men. But we have to add to that, because the Irish were extraordinarily ethnically cohesive. In Britain, in Canada, and in the United States, if you were born in one of those countries into an Irish family, you would have seen yourself as ethnically Irish. We know this from the letters from the Civil War. We know it from all the study that's been done. The estimates of the number of Irish children of Irish parents who serve in the Civil War is 70,000. Lots of the guys you'll see is born in England or born in Canada are ethnically Irish when you're looking at your regimental stuff. And we can see some of them here. These are 3 men I've worked on that I know all saw themselves as Irish American, all who either died as a result of Gettysburg or at Gettysburg itself. If any of you know this book, which is a very famous memoir of time in the Army of the Potomac, Thomas Francis Galway, an Irishman in the Civil War. That's my rather battered copy of it. Not a great looking slide. He was a Fenian, born in London, as indeed was I. Saw himself as Irish. Okay? So this leaves us with a total figure of Irish American service of 250,000 men. 250,000 men serving in the United States military were what I would classify as Irish Americans. So they shared a lot of ethnic traits, a lot of community backgrounds, but they were a diverse group within themselves with differing life experiences. The popular image of the Irish soldier of the American Civil War is of the recently arrived famine immigrant, and a lot of them were recently arrived famine immigrants, but there were also many who arrived here before the famine. There's a big Irish community in America before then, and those who came during the war itself. There were men who left Ireland when they were adults, and there were men who grew up on the streets of the 5 Points or in Boston's North End. Neither were they all Catholic. There were thousands of Irish Anglicans and Presbyterians who served here. And so these are just a couple of examples, and thanks to Mark Dunkelman, the historian of the 154th New York. Mark was the person who told me about Barney first and sent me his image. Barney was no spring chicken here. And he had step migrated all the way through and was a pre-famine immigrant. And this is Irish Presbyterian Hugh McGraw, who was mortally wounded at Little Round Top. That's his last letter to his mother, sent just a little before the battle. So where then did these guys serve? As we might expect, the vast majority joined the military from the urban heartlands. Irish immigrants are hugely rural when they come from Ireland and overwhelmingly urban when they come to the United States. Most of them live in cities and towns. And it's the Irish heartlands of Irish America along the Atlantic seaboard that we see the most. And nowhere rivals New York. At least 51,000 Irish-born men, not Irish-American, not including the children, 51,000 Irish-born go into the volunteer units out of New York State. And as I was mentioning, that's about 3 times more than the following state, Pennsylvania, which is, again, in turn ahead of Massachusetts. And we can see concentrations like that at places like Gettysburg. If you look at a brigade like the Excelsior Brigade, it's a reasonable estimate that between 40 and 50 of their fatal casualties at Gettysburg are Irish American, which represents about 1/3 of their losses on the field. All right? The Irish weren't just present, and this is why the numbers have always been incorrect, because the numbers have only ever been counted for volunteers. They've excluded groups like the regulars. They were the dominant immigrant group. There were more Irish-born than American-born soldiers in Fort Sumter when it was fired on in April 1861, for example. 40% of the United States regulars at the outbreak of the American Civil War had been born in Ireland. Again, not Irish-American, born in Ireland. In the region on that map I showed you, so far, of 21 different US regular infantry, cavalry, and artillery units at Gettysburg suffered an Irish-American fatality, right? That's probably higher than that. I think it's most forcefully demonstrated, and it gets you to think about our memory and how we think about the Irish when you look at the Wheatfield fight. Right? So the Irish Brigade completely dominate our perception of the Wheatfield. The Irish Brigade went into the Wheatfield with 530 men. They lost around 32 to mortal wounds. Sidney Burbank's Brigade of Regulars, 2nd Division, 5th Corps, also fight in that part of the field. They had 900 men, and we know from looking at statistics that no more than half of them are Irish American, right? So about 450 men, slightly less than the Irish Brigade. They suffer 32. Irish-born fatalities, with more who are the children of Irish immigrants. So Burbank's regular brigade in the Wheatfield, the losses they sustain has a bigger impact on Irish mothers, Irish wives, Irish children, on Irish-American communities than the Irish Brigade losses do. And just to add to that, 1 in 4 of the dead from Hannibal Day's regular brigade who fight in the same area are also Irish-born. Again, not Irish-American, just Irish-born. So the regulars are really one of the major stories in the Wheatfield when we're thinking about the Irish. So I've skipped that, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The heavy concentration of Irish Americans in volunteer units from New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts also has a bearing on where they fight the war. So to be of surprise to no surprise to anybody here that they're heavily concentrated in the Eastern Theatre, heavily concentrated in the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the James. I don't think you could have thrown a stone 2 yards in the 2nd Corps without hitting an Irishman, for example. And what I would say is that we need to reorientate how we think about the impact of these battles on the Irish. So often we think about Antietam, Irish Brigade, Fredericksburg, Irish Brigade, these massive losses. What impact are they having on the Irish? But we need to change that to look at the urban units from New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, wherever it may be. If an urban unit has a bad day on a battlefield in the American Civil War, there are death notifications flooding into Irish American communities all over the north. Okay? That's the numbers bit done then. So we can move on to talk about some of the experiences that we get out of their letters. And I'm only going to be able to touch on a small number of them this evening. But in broad terms, much of what they wrote about, complained about, and they did complain an awful lot, and celebrated, bears comparison to the majority of other soldiers and sailors. So you see those similarities, both north and south. They grumbled about the weather, complained those at home didn't write enough. You'd think these guys had emails, honestly. Some of them are a day or two after they sent a letter. You've not replied. What's going on? Write to me. Have you forgotten who I am? And they just all do it. We see that all through the Civil War, of course. They were always going on about the rising costs of tobacco. They describe military movements, life in camp. They ruminate on how well or badly they were adapting to soldiering. There is no evidence for this exceptional lust for combat, this stereotype of the fighting Irish we hear so much. They are no different in terms of how brave or not brave they are than any other man in the Northern military. One thing they did expect, which is quite interesting, is they did expect the man standing beside them to do their duty. And if they didn't, they were quick to dob him out to their Irish American community at home. So even in a non-ethnic unit, they'd be really harsh if another Irish American they felt let them down on the field, right? Which is an interesting point. But they have all these similarities, but there are some notable points of difference. And a lot of these differences are just in a kind of an extremity level to other people. And I'm going to go through a couple of them. One of them revolves around their faith, right? The vast majority of Irish American troops, probably in excess of 200,000 of those who serve, were Catholic. But despite the fact that there's this overwhelming number of them are Catholic, only around 53 Catholic chaplains are known to have served in the Civil War. So the chances were for many of these men that in their time in service, they would not encounter a Catholic priest. And this is very important. We were just out at the Corby statue yesterday and the absolution. That absolution had a very real purpose for those men in that brigade. That was allowing them, if they were getting absolution, to be prepared for death if it happens. And if you don't have a Catholic priest to do that for you when you're going into combat, that's an issue. And some men join ethnic regiments just because there's Catholic clergy there. But the guys who are outside that have to think about different ways of trying to prepare for that eventuality. So Thomas Doyle and his friend, who both were at Gettysburg in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry, what they did was they went to confession before they enlisted. They received the Holy Sacrament, and I'm quoting here, left $5 apiece for masses while we were away, trying to look after their souls while they were gone. Another man who was here was Thomas Monaghan with the 95th Pennsylvania Infantry, and he wrote to thank his mother for, quote, the mass you have got said for me. So the families are trying to do it as well. But it was physical sacramentals, especially the ones that you could wear around the neck. Sorry, that's where my microphone is. You could wear around the neck. Things like scapulars and Agnus Dei, they were the most important thing. And you see it again and again and again and again that they're wearing these items. You recall that some of them were found in 1988 at Antietam. Those items were important for the devout, but they took on kind of a protective talisman function for thousands of these men. So one of them, who we know was wearing a new set here, was a guy called William Dwyer of the Irish Brigade. And because he talks about it. He talked about his old scapulars that had seen him through the bloodbaths of Antietam and Fredericksburg. But in January 1863, he says he has to replace them. He says, and I quote here, "They were all war, and I lost the part that goes down my back." Of course, the most important interactions for many of these men was with the people who were sending them a lot of these religious items, and that's with the home front. There are many really important facets to the relationship between Irish Americans and the home front, but one of the most crucial ones that I really want to talk about here is the money that they were sending home. Because Irish Americans, probably as an identifiable bloc, are the most economically precarious white soldiers in Northern military. They're in low-wage jobs. Normally, they move up and down through the labor system consistently. Most of them are in rented urban accommodation. Their lives are very, very precariously financially balanced. And so you see money and the economy shine through all the time. And it's the economic opportunities that the military offered were very important to these men. A lot of them had lost work early during the secession crisis. But while it gave them a guaranteed income, the federal government was an absolute disaster at paying these guys on time, right? The challenge of regularly paying the men was just not met during the war. And so you see examples of this issue all the time. Richard Sheridan, who we saw a letter of earlier, he fought and died here in the ranks of the 82nd New York Infantry. After he left for the front, he had to pay for all his father's bills. He was responsible for them. And he writes, "I suppose your landlord and grocer think I am very good as long as I send the greenbacks. If I was home tomorrow, I do not think I would remain a customer of either of them long." He was raging because he thought his father was being done financially by these guys. But it was a real precarity. It wasn't imagined. Richard dies here at the Battle of Gettysburg, and his father ends his life in Blackwell's Island's almshouse because he can't support himself. All right? We see similar concern for the economic well-being of the family of Michael Brennan, who was here with the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry of the Iron Brigade. He'd been in convalescent camp during the winter of 62 and 63, and so missed his last muster for pay. So when he wrote in March 1863, the main topic is money. "I've not got $1 of my regular pay since I got a few dollars extra pay for work, but not enough hardly to keep me in tobacco at the prices we have to pay now. I'm in hopes that I will get it by the 1st of next month if the regiment is paid by that time, which I hope in God it will. I shall do the best I can to get it, and when I do, you shall get the most of it with the help of God. I know that you must stand in need of it all winter, but God knows I could not help it. I tried my best to get it, but could not." But thankfully he did get it. He was able to send $30 home to his mother at the end of April, before he was killed in action here on the 1st of July with the Iron Brigade. Another who had this sense of economic responsibility was Christopher McGiff of the 119th New York Infantry, who had to take on the role, even though he was really young, of being the main breadwinner because his father was an alcoholic. He wrote to his mother saying, "You must not think I won't send my money. I will send it while I have two hands. I will work for you like a man." And he also dies here on the 1st of July, serving with the 11th Corps. But by far the most significant obstacle these guys have in communicating with home is that the Irish Americans are also the least literate bloc of white men who serve in the Northern military. And we know, in fact, even, there's statistics in some of the wards in New York of 20%. They lied on the census. They were lying on the census and saying they were literate when they weren't, because we can see it in the widows' pension files. So sometimes the men were having to use these amanuensis, as we call them, scribes to write for them. And you can't tell the letters apart unless you can see they're in different hands. They're written exactly the same way. Even where they could write, in many cases, their parents couldn't read themselves, these Irish immigrant parents. So you have this constant problem of guys, I couldn't write to you because I didn't know where you lived, because you didn't give me your address, and all this sort of stuff. It didn't stop them giving out, though, if they felt the wrong people were reading their letters. Christopher McGiff, who we were just mentioning, was giving out to his mother because he met this woman when he was down on service down near DC, who was able to tell him everything about what he'd said. He says, "She could tell me everything I sent home in a letter and had a laugh over it. Dear mother, you must keep your mind to yourself and not tell everyone what I sent home." And his mother is illiterate, so he knows someone else has to read the letter, but he's still expecting her to manage who can read it. We know from the work of the late lamented Professor Peter Carmichael, who needs no introduction, in Gettysburg, and his really important work on common soldiers, that a lot of these semi-literate men have a habit of writing really matter-of-fact, to the point letters that don't kind of hold back. And I want to give you an example of John O'Brien, 65th New York Infantry. He served here on Culp's Hill. He wrote home to his mother. She lived, if you know Old St. Patrick's Cathedral, she lived right beside that in New York. So you're getting a kind of down, not far from 5 Points territory. But this is what he wrote home to her about his accounts in Fredericksburg, and I'll read it to you. "Mother, many a good man went across the river but never come back. It was murder. You couldn't compare it to anything else. We had to stay on the plain and look up on the rebels in their fortifications and redoubts. I believe they could have slain every man that crossed the river if they opened their guns on us. We lost about 9 out of our regiment. I was as lucky as any in the field. I might thank my lying for my life. The shell came so close that I dodged it, and it took the next company. It took 2 men. If I had not dropped to the ground as soon as the shell left the gun, my head would have been swept off." Now you can imagine his mother probably having this read to her. and the entire tenement dwelling would have known it. But there is an awful irony to this, and think about her having received that letter, because on the 3rd of July here, a solid shot fired by the Confederates passed through his body, and he was one of only 4 fatalities out of his 319-strong regiment. So he dies the way he had described to her previously. And just to reinforce the point I'm making, in his regiment, which is not an Irish regiment, 3 of the 4 men who died in that unit, all in different companies, were Irish Americans. Okay? One of the other things we consistently see with Irish American troops who didn't serve in these green flag units is how ethnically cohesive they are. So even if there's just 2 or 3 Irish guys in a company, they will tend to coalesce. They're the guys who write their letters for them. They're the guys who, if somebody dies, they'll tell them about it. So the Irish Americans coalesce even when they didn't know each other before. I mentioned Thomas Doyle earlier. He dies down in Devil's Den with the 4th Maine, born in England. He had written a couple of months previously to his Irish-born wife back in Maine about how his closest friend, John Ward, another man in the regiment, was missing in action. And they had both been in the Irish community in Searsport. They were next-door neighbours when they enlisted. And Thomas wrote to her, "I feel lonesome without him, for John and me always tented together." We see this again and again and again. Another Irishman who hadn't known them before from a different part of the state then was the man who took care of this missing man's belongings, an Irishman by the name of Michael Butler, according to Thomas. So a non-Irish regiment, but the Irish are sticking together. They're the ethnic bonds, though, that are most frequently exposed when a soldier died. Arthur Mulholland was one of the unfortunate members of the 69 Pennsylvania Infantry who was captured at the Stone Wall during Pickett's charge and dragged back across the field. He's one of 3 of those men who died in Andersonville prison as a result. We know in Andersonville that he stuck with Irish guys because we know that John Doyle of the 183rd Pennsylvania Infantry gave evidence to say he had seen him alive in the camp. And another Irishman, Robert Torrey, who'd been drafted into the 90th Pennsylvania, all different units, was the man who, quote, placed his name, company, and regiment on his breast and lowered Arthur into the burial pit. I want to turn now to discuss some of the other challenges Irish Americans faced in service. I'm sure most of you're aware about nativism, anti-Catholicism that the Irish suffered during the pre-war. A lot of this also followed them into the war. So we know from the work of historians like Stephen Ramold that if you were Irish and you committed the same offence as a native-born white American, it was more likely you were going to be punished if you were Irish, right, in the military. And a good example of this, and another man who fought here, is Henry Livermore Abbott, who's a very prolific writer from the Civil War. He fought here with the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, the Harvard Regiment, filled with Irish again. 1 in 4 men in his regiment were Irish-born. But he didn't like the Irish, and he didn't like the working classes. The top 3 quotes there are some of his quotes from his writings. Again, you often see the urban New York, Philadelphia. It's usually a kind of a way of saying Irish as well. But Abbott gives us an insight into what happens when you're serving under an officer who doesn't like Irish guys in a lot of the war. He lost a lot of his men in the street fighting in Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and he wrote the letters of condolence back to Irish families about it. He informed the immigrant mother of James Breedy of the great pang that struck him when he saw her son lying dead and how strongly he felt the greatness of the loss. He wrote to the sister of Cork native John Deasy to speak about how the Irishman was honest and brave and his hope that his orphan children would be properly cared for. So what we see with men like Abbott is that though he probably never lost his feelings of superiority over the working class men or the Irish, the kind of nativist type of attitude, the relationships he was developing during the course of the war with his men was mitigating what he was doing. As long as these guys stayed in line, he saw them as good soldiers. We finally get to the main man, of course. You couldn't possibly talk about the Irish here without the most famous man. Also, he died here as well, in case you didn't know that, Buster Kilrain. But there was actually an Irish guy in the 20th Maine. And he's not terribly dissimilar to this character. He was a Wexford native called Tommy Welsh. I think, and I was talking to Wayne about this yesterday, I don't think he was actually on Little Round Top because July and August says he was detached on divisional duty, but he's in the regiment. And he was called Uncle Tommy because of his age. And there is no doubt this guy now was incredibly ancient. He was really, really old. He was at least 38. So his life was practically over when he was serving. But prior to joining up, he had been supporting his elderly parents. He was a seasonal log rafter, moving between Maine and Canada on New Brunswick's Nashwauk River. And he's clearly very popular in the 20th Maine, but I think you see the low-level kind of nativist attitude, nativist maybe is too strong a word, but prejudice against the Irish in the history of the 20th Maine written after the war by Theodore Gerrish. He describes Tommy's most laughable blunders. He describes his slowness to obey commands, and he talks of his, quote, bewildered serio-comic gravity of expression for which the Emerald Isle is so noted. They're all aspects of stage Irishism, right, which is a big kind of popular 19th century stage kind of the Irish, what we would say in Ireland, a bit of an Egypt, right? And so even though he's massively fond of him, there's this air of superiority. Right? And he wrote his epitaph in it. Unfortunately, Tommy doesn't survive the war. He says, poor Tommy Welsh, brave, blundering and kind, was a favourite in his company, and his comrades all mourned when he was shot down in the wilderness. He was taken prisoner and carried to Andersonville, where he died of starvation. I've actually stood at his grave. He's one of 1,050 Irish Americans we've so far identified, by the way, in an Andersonville project, but that's a different lecture. But in any event. I do want to mention here, even though I'm not going to be able to go into it in detail, the Irish Americans faced discrimination, but they surely doled it out themselves as well in fairly significant proportions to African Americans, right? So I'm not going to go, I have a section on their attitudes towards African Americans and explaining why they have those attitudes to African Americans in the book. But their antipathy towards African Americans is by and large borne out in enlisted men's correspondence. It's evident too that they really firmly believed in their racial superiority to African Americans. The Irish too were not major supporters of the Emancipation Proclamation. They remained strong adherents to the Democratic Party. They didn't like the Republicans. One of them described Lincoln as a broken down old lawyer. In many of their eyes, the Republican Party, because it had anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic opponents, were not their friends, and radical abolitionists were also, a lot of them were also anti-Catholic and anti-Irish, and they didn't like them for that either. So, Irish Americans have a whole shopping list, as long as your arm, of reasons not to be serving in the US military. It's been speculated because many were recent immigrants, their commitment to the United States was more lukewarm than people who've been here for a long time, but there's 250,000 of them in uniform. And in places like New York, we know they serve above their proportion of the population. The other thing I'd like to say is there's a view that the Irish kind of abandoned the war effort after the Emancipation Proclamation, and that may be the view from the home front, but there is no evidence to show a fall-off in Irish numbers after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. In fact, the evidence we do have suggests that Irish Americans were proportionately more willing to enlist in the US service than native-born white American lads in 1863 and 1864 because of the enormous economic bounties that were life-changing for them in those periods. There's very little work done. There's a couple of new books out recently, actually. Very little work done on those late war recruits. But it's an interesting aspect. Again, it's something I go into more detail. Again, it's the concentration on the ethnic units that we've been forced into that kind of shows it's all about Ireland, the Irishness. It's not about America. These guys are more interested in Ireland. But when you look at the wider picture, you see things like, I'm sending you money for the 4th of July. The 4th of July is mentioned multiple times more than St. Patrick's Day. You have guys going on pilgrimage to Washington's grave. You have guys going to see where Cornwallis surrendered to America. All of this is what you start to see. You see how important the United States is to them, okay? It's all over it. And we see it in how they refer to themselves as well. There we go. When they talk of their country, it's not Ireland they're talking about. It is always America, doing their duty to their country. And they might have got off the boat a couple of weeks before the Civil War broke out. When they refer to themselves, they don't talk about Irish, they don't talk about Irish America, they talk about the Rochester boys, the Pittsburgh boys, the Salem boys. And it is usually the Irish community in Rochester or Pittsburgh or Salem that they're talking about. But that's their community, not Irish America, it's that Irish community. Men like Jeremiah Keenan, another man who died on Little Round Top at the 140th New York, who always spoke about the Churchville boys. Daniel Reddy, who fought here with the 16th Massachusetts, when he was writing home about the losses in his unit, talks about how all the Woburn boys are gone but Foley and me. It makes me feel very lonesome when I think of it. And we're able to look up the boys he's talking about. They're all Irish, but they're all from Woburn. So what we're seeing here is a hybrid identity, right? They are the American Irish. So we talk about the Irish Americans. They are going into the war identifying with their local American community. This hybrid identity is really important when it comes to considering service because of the focus on the ethnic regiments has led to that assessment that more of them identify with Ireland than America. But, and I'm going to mention these guys in a minute, when we're looking at the actual reality, very few of them are like these, right? So you'll often read in books that getting military experience to go back and fight for Ireland is a major reason for enlistment. It isn't. It is not. Enlisted men's main engagement with Ireland is sending money to Ireland to get the people over here. They might support Fenianism, they might support the general struggle. They have no intention of ever returning to Ireland. They want to transpose those communities here. I've said that now, but because it's Gettysburg, there are a lot of really interesting Fenians here, so you can give a talk about that in and of itself. I did just want to mention a couple of them. The most senior here, he was an 1848 young Irelander, James Houston, killed here commanding the 2nd New York State Militia. He was a friend of John Mitchell, who was an 1848er who became a big Confederate supporter. John Mitchell's son is killed in the 1st Virginia in Pickett's charge facing him, and James Houston had named his first son for John Mitchell's other son. That's how close they were. These two I had to include because of the images. There's officers all over the field. You could go on for it all night. But Morris Fitzharris, wounded during Pickett's charge, 42nd New York Tammany. Dennis Burke, who commands the 88th New York and dedicates the monument. These are their Fenian mugshots from when they went back to Ireland in 1866 to try and start the rebellion and were immediately picked up by the British authorities. And like Dennis Burke, look at the look on his face. You can just imagine if you let him loose. Right? He's some guy, Dennis Burke. But anyway, I just had to include them. But, you know, because these guys are famous, so we always look at the Fenians. You know, and the Fenians are really interesting to look at, but very few of the ordinary guys are actually enlisting there. To kind of bring it towards a conclusion then, there are two main motivators that we see. And these motivations, there's no kind of usually very rarely a single motivator. They're not mutually exclusive. There's lots of different reasons why guys enlist. I've said that economics and preserving the Union, patriotism to the United States, are the overwhelming two reasons. Thomas Doyle of the 4th Maine, who I've mentioned a few times, dies here in Devil's Den. Says he enlists because when he joined up, the times began to look very gloomy and dull, and he had not wanted to be dependent upon anyone for his support. Again, a massive recession is occurring in the North right when this war starts, because secession creates that recession. And it's a lot of Irish Americans who are losing their jobs. Men in the 42nd New York Infantry from the very beginning of the war were being offered a whole load of bonuses to enlist. So it's not just your monthly wage. One of them says here, 100 acres of land at the close of the war is what they're going to get. And he's been told that at the start of the conflict, right? So this is very important. It's often said, you know, it wasn't economically viable. It was, particularly if you were Irish. The other element we see is union and patriotism. And it didn't matter what people thought about the Emancipation Proclamation or African Americans or the Republicans or Abraham Lincoln. All of that was superseded for a lot of Irish Americans by preserving the country. Let's return to Tommy Welsh, the real Buster Kilrain, if you like. In a letter typically understated to his brother in Fredericksburg, after Fredericksburg, their first kind of major engagement, he talks about how they had trouble and trials, which Isn't how I would have described Fredericksburg, but in any event. But he says, I bear them willingly and more because this flag has given protection to our persecuted countrymen. Michael McCormick of the 65th New York Infantry, who fought here, expressed his confidence in victory but added that he was in no hurry to go home. I do not want to go home until this war is over. Then I would be satisfied, but not before. This is the way Irish Americans express this stuff. They don't go in for what officers would be writing about. You must be stoic, my dear wife, because we are fighting for the preservation of the country. You can't write that to somebody who's in a rented accommodation who could end up on the street. It's much more understated kind of duty that they're putting forward. Another example, Clare immigrant Martin Noonan of the 64th New York Infantry said he was looking forward to the day when, quote, we will be planting the poles for the glorious stars and stripes to wave over the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Massively invested in the United States. Irish Americans may have been amongst the latest arrivals, but they felt they'd already carved out their position and demonstrated their commitment to their new country. Rather than something they viewed as facilitating their efforts to become American, it's readily apparent that tens of thousands of them entered the American Civil War in the fervent belief that they already were Americans. For men like that, enlistment during the war was less of an attempt to prove their worth and more of a duty that they felt morally obliged to perform. And they did it when they knew that others didn't regard them that way, and also probably likely recognized that it was going to be a long struggle ahead for them. But still, 250,000 ethnic Irish who fought for the US did so in the belief they were fighting for their country, every bit as much as any of their native comrades who touched elbows with them on the battlefield. And I leave you with this. This is in Gettysburg National Cemetery. It's the grave of Irish immigrant John Clark of the 65th New York Infantry. And this was the way his widow was told that he had died. Your husband was laying on his back, calmly talking of the Union, when a fragment of shell struck him, nearly taking both legs off. I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
We're gonna rush Damian up to the signing table. I just want to say, on behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation, I want to thank Chris Gwynn, the Chief of Interpretation and Education, and the staff of the park for co-sponsoring this event with us. I want to thank our staff, the Gettysburg Foundation, Lori Wright, who's outside, Connie, the security staff, Jeff Miller, who's doing the AV, and Steve Miller, no relation, who's doing the recording. So you will be able to see this. It will be on the YouTube channel, and you will be able to look at it. And we just want to thank all of you for attending and your interest in the Gettysburg Foundation, the Gettysburg National Military Park's park partner. Please go outside and pick up your copy of Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military. And thanks for coming.